Well, welcome back to another great episode here, another great conversation here at Table Talk TV. Today, we're going to be touching on an interesting conversation that we kind of ended with in the last episode. So if you don't know what we're talking about, go back and watch the last episode. But colleague here was alluding to the fact that there may be some biblical proof text that could sway him to possibly being post-millennial, like we said in the last episode. Currently, our positions here, if you're not sure of it, we're all millennialists, but we're open-minded, as hopefully all of you guys are. And we're always available to be corrected, to be changed. You know, if the scripture tells us something, we need to put the priority of our convictions in our scriptures. So, the question that we're going to be asking today, does our money management, does our wealth management predicate our eternal security? Stay tuned. We're going to talk about it. So, Mr. Colleague, what is this mysterious scripture that you left us with last week?
Luke chapter 16.
And are you going to become post-millennial?
Yes.
Well, maybe you should.
No, I don't know yet. I'll wait. I'm legitimately teeter-tottering on this idea because of this passage before us.
Well, maybe you should, before we get started, elaborate why this is even important. Like, why should people consider the millennial propositions? And, you know, we don't have to go into what is premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial.
We'll just assume that everybody knows what amill, premill, and postmill means.
Now, why should we even consider this as an important thing at all?
Well, it's going to change the way you live your life and the way you read your Bible. Because if you are an amillennialist, of course, you see the kingdom as spiritual. So this physical earth is going to burn. The kingdom is spiritual, so you're not really going to be involved in political affairs and all that other stuff. If you're a post-millennialist, you do care about this physical world because the physical world is the kingdom. So if you believe the kingdom is physical, you're post-millennialist. If you believe it's spiritual, you're an amillennialist.
Just to clarify, but you're not saying it's absolute. Like, even though somebody may be amillennialist, they could involve themselves in political things and all that, but that wouldn't be what you're saying. It's not the priority.
They don't see the kingdom. The heavenly kingdom is spiritual.
Right. They're really we'll use the phrase, they're really a two-kingdom person.
Right.
And they're really separating the physical from the spiritual. So you could still be involved in politics, but that's because it helps your earthly life, not so much that it's going to change your spiritual condition. Yeah,
it's like eating. Like, we still, even though you may be a member in the amillennial kingdom, spiritually, you still have to eat physical food, and you have to take care of your physical children and your physical wife, physical house, and all that stuff. You have to pay physical bills. Now, premillennialists also believe the kingdom is physical, just like postmillennialists, but they believe that it's not here yet, so it's not coming in. So we're not going to touch on that. I personally am teeter-tottering between amill and postmill eschatologies, because it's going to change how you read the entire Bible and how you live your life.
Yeah, and I think people should appreciate that in some sense because of that very reason, is because if the Bible is exclusively declaring to us, as I was alluding, the question in the opening is, does our wealth management or money management alter or is predicated or is dependent on, whatever adjective you want to use, on our eternal condition? Like, God is going to judge us eternally. Like, if you believe in some kind of progressive sanctification or progressive glorification, or I guess what people would call future justification, is that predicated on how I dealt with my worldly acclimates? Like, if God gives me something, or how do I take care of the earth, or all these things, is God going to see my future condition based on that? Then yeah, I really need to change my perspective in climate change. I need to really fix my position on littering, or how good am I spending my money? Where am I spending it? Because
recycling, yeah,
because that would change how God sees me when I see Him.
Well, not only that, but how you are going to live in eternity, because Postmillennialists believe that this earth is heaven, and therefore we need to renew it. So they interpret Revelation as not saying that there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, but a renewed heaven and renewed earth. So God is not going to discard this earth. He's going to renew this earth through us, through politics, through recycling, through, making this earth a better place. So yeah, it makes a difference. If you want to live in a good place for eternity, you probably want to fix it up.
So simply put,
trash.
If earth is going to be my heaven, my eternal state, then of course, why would I want to blaspheme heaven?
Sure. Yeah. Why would you want to destroy it? You should fix it up.
I'd be actively trying to be a participant, an active participant in the restoration of it to heaven, back to the Eden state, the prelapsarian Eden state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And amillennialists, because they believe the kingdom is spiritual, they typically see this earth as being destroyed, and then we're going to get a brand new heaven and a new earth. So they take that passage in Revelation and again in Isaiah to mean new, not renewed.
Yeah,
So-
I guess that's another thing, to reiterate, that would be the contrast reason is if I believe heaven is out of this earth, then God wouldn't have put much responsibility, not that I should be irresponsible of my life. Of course, that's that two-kingdom mentality. Of course, I want to live a fruitful life so I can be fruitful in the Great Commission. But that's not predicating my eternal state. My eternal state, because I would believe that it's out of this earth. It's some supernatural existence that's not material. It's somewhere else. It's super metamaterial. It's somewhere else. God wouldn't really judge me based upon those. He might judge me on the philosophical sense of why were you being foolish, not using it for preaching the gospel or something, but not so much like, why didn't you love the earth?
Well, that's what it is. Amillennialists are more inclined to preach the gospel and go after the spiritual kingdom. So that's where their money goes, is for spiritual matters.
More exclusively.
Yeah. The post-millennial people typically go towards the physical gospel.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I get why people would think this. So I do think it's an important matter to consider.
Well, they do have every verse. If you're an amillennialist or a post-millennialist or premillennialist and you think, well, how do they explain this verse? How do they explain that verse? Trust me, they do. There's books written on all of these verses. Except the one that I'm about to talk about. I don't know how people have missed this one, but it's a very important one, I think. And I guess you guys can tell me what you think about it. And if there are books written on it, I've been, trying to find them. So you guys could point me in the right direction.
Well, take away all this mystery that you have been leaving us for a week and
With pleasure.
take us to the promised land.
So, if you guys want to come with me to the promised land, and boom, here's the promised land.
What are we looking at?
Well, it's a little bit like heaven. This is Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 9. I'm just going to go ahead and read it for you guys. And so here's the Greek version and here's the English version. You're going to see why at the end, why the Greek is important. Because this is not something that is that should be considered lightly. So I'll just read it for you. Jesus also said to the disciples, there was a rich man who was informed of accusations that his manager was wasting his assets. So he called the manager in and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Turn in the account of your administration, because you can no longer be my manager. Then the manager said to himself, what should I do, since my master is taking my position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm too ashamed to beg. I know what to do, so that when I'm put out of management, people will welcome me into their homes. So he contacted his master's debtors one by one. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? The man replied, 100 measures of olive oil. The manager said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, and how much do you owe? The second man replied, 100 measures of wheat. The manager said to him, take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their contemporaries than the people of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by how you use worldly wealth, so that when it runs out, you will be welcomed into the eternal homes.
Mm.
So there's a lot here. Somehow a lot of people miss what's going on here. So I'll just very briefly summarize. The rich man was being fired for accusations made about him. He's probably some cheap swindler guy who was, taking a little too much off the top. So what he does is he goes to his servants and he cuts their bills in half. And he does this to make friends with them. So this is what he's being commended for making friends with people, because then in his mindset, being a common Israelite of the time, when the resurrection happens, he will be able to live in their homes. According to Jesus, this is the whole point of why he did what he did. If you look at verse 9, he says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by how you use worldly wealth, so that when it runs out, you will be welcomed into the eternal homes. So this seems to be talking about the age that is coming, or the post-resurrection era. So this is a lot. What are your thoughts, host?
Well, I guess it just depends on how you interpret this in a larger spectrum. Because however you take this passage, I assume you're going to have to use this as a continual basis. Like, is Jesus trying to predicate that the most important thing is preserving a place for you? Or is this a reference to simply being a good steward as those of the world, saying, we know the world are already very shrewd. We know they're not going to be friendly to you. So why are you being so ignorant? So it's one of the two. Either Christ is trying to make an allusion to the fact of don't be ignorant of what the world does, lest you be stuck into trash. But be like them, like he was said many times, be gentle as a dove, but shrewd as a serpent. So it could be either that, or he could be predicating the idea that there is something that you're going to need in a future time frame, which is a place to live, a place to exist. And this is going to be, you're only going to have this if you are wise in this earth. And if you're not going to have an eternal home. So it's one of the two. You can either see this as a overarching parable of his larger context of work, or you're going to see this as an exclusive parable, which is giving you almost like I'll just say Gnostic, but it's not, this like nugget in here that's trying to tell you a deeper, insightful information that kind of, you would say it almost is hard to mend in with the rest of Jesus's narratives, because Jesus is always talking about, Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He's always talking about, give to the poor. He's always talking about who cares about my purse, my money. But now he's saying, but you gotta really focus on that. So is this really some kind of nugget that he's showing us something? Well, let me tell you also this extra thing, this thing that's really what I'm talking about. Or is this just an overarching parable to be wise?
Yeah, to me, it seems like it's a parable to be wise. He's saying, look, you can make all the money in the world, but don't forget, sometimes money fails. And when money fails, so he's commending, make money for this age and the age to come. But in your making money, don't forget to make friends as well. So it seems like this is why he's commending this wicked manager.
I think the interesting part, which is probably why you brought this out, is he uses that phrase, eternal homes. Mm-hmm. And that's probably where the stickler comes. Like, what do you mean, Jesus, by eternal homes?
And that is the question at hand. Those two words. So I already did the work for you guys. Right here, you can see the Greek term for eternal over here on the right. It's ionos, and then skenos right here, as you can see, is what this English translation, NET, translated as homes. It actually means, and you can see over to the far right of the screen, over here, you can see it also means tent or tabernacle. So here's different translations. So LSB, NASB, ESV, HSB, NASB 95 all say dwellings. ASV, Darby, Young's literal translation all says tabernacles, because that's actually what the Greek says, is tabernacles or tents. NLT and New King James says home. NET Second Edition says homes. And the Vulgate, Clement Vulgate says tabernacula for Dracula.
That's spectacular.
That's spectacular. So as you can see, this Greek term here is not oikonos, which would be home. This is skenos, which is tabernacle. So the English should say eternal tents or tabernacles, which gives a big clue as to what Jesus is talking about, especially in light of what Revelation talks about, that we're going to be living under God's great tabernacle in the end, the eschaton.
So what are you alluding that this could infer to a eternal position? If it's the great tabernacle, is our wealth management going to provide us a eternal tabernacle?
Well, it's not. Yeah, that's what it seems like. So the friends you make, what Jesus seems to be saying here in a post-millennial light, is that you should make friends here and now, make wealth, but also make friends. Don't make so much wealth that you're stepping on all your friends. Make wealth and friends. And then when the resurrection happens, and when this world is renewed, you will have homes to stay in.
So you're saying that he's trying to separate. It sounds like he's connecting it, but what you're saying, he's more or less continuing the narrative that what you do here is going to allow the function for your ability to be somewhere else? Or is he saying it's for here, and then also there's going to be this eternal home somewhere else? Because
so for example, everyone has neighbors, and you should be friends with them, because in eternity, let's say they are resurrected with you also in the eternity, you will be welcomed into their home. If you don't have a home in the eternal state, when the earth is renewed and in the resurrection, you may not have a home, but you'll be welcomed into your friend's home because you made friends.
So he's saying, is this like an allusion towards the persecution he was warning them in the apocalyptical literatures, the Olivet Discourses? Because, I mean, when I think about this, because everything has to be contextual in some sense, unless you believe there's a secret nuggets, right? Assuming that this is all a parable for his overarching narrative, he believes that, you disciples, you people, will really feel this real persecution very shortly. And you're going to need places to stay here also. You're going to need protection here on this earth. And this could allude to the fact that Jesus is warning on both sides of the coin. If you aren't wise and make friends and shrewd with your wealth here, when this apocalyptic time comes, you're going to be left out with nothing. And then there's not going to be this gospel, which is eternal, this ability to spread this eternal propagation. Your eternal state is conditioned on the gospel. But if you're not wise with your money, you may not have protection. You may not have a place to stay. You may not be able to expand this gospel because you weren't wise with the people in this world.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind saying that. But that's what's tough, is because that Greek term is ionos, which is eternal. And it is in the plural genitive, so it is talking about this skenos, the tents or tabernacles, eternal tabernacles.
So then is that what it's trying to allude to? Because when it says when your wealth runs out, does that mean your life? Does that mean your money? Does that mean earthly responsibility? When it runs out, then it's almost sound like he's predicating on the condition. Then you can be welcomed into eternal homes. So it's almost conditional. if you are wealthy, then you can be welcomed.
No, not if you're wealthy, if you have friends.
Yeah, if
Seems
you're
like that's
wise
the
with
whole
your
point of
wealth
this.
and making friends, right?
Yeah, the whole point of this parable seems to be, and again, in the comments section, I'd love to see what you guys think about this parable and how you explain verse 9 here, because Jesus sums up the whole parable with verse 9. He says that this guy was this shrewd manager is commended because he made friends for himself. So that way, in the eternal state, in eternity, literally in eternity, even if he loses his home and all of his stocks go to trash and it does this reverse split or whatever, he will still have a place to stay with his friends. It seems like that's what Jesus is saying. Now, whether that was back then in a preterist understanding or whether that's still to come, we still have to figure out what these eternal homes are.
Well, that's
are
what
these
I was,
eternal homes spiritual or physical?
That's what I was trying to figure out. Your idea is, since it doesn't matter if it's homes, tabernacles, it's going to be an internal condition of some sort. Can't get rid of the eternal state. So it's an internal condition. And is that eternal condition predicated on friends then? Is it predicated on wealth then? Is it predicated on my responsibility then, my stewardship? Is any of these things, because that would mean my justification isn't somewhat dependent on something.
Well, no, because it seems to be that you can be, according to the parable, you can be a broke manager who is in the eternal state, but you just don't have a place to stay. So you're justified, you made it to heaven, but you don't have a house to stay in. And because you burned everybody before you got to this eternal state, nobody's going to let you into their house in this eternal estate.
So what
it's just a weird parable for Jesus to talk about.
Right.
I don't know if it has so much to do with justification or maybe a little bit of sanctification.
We'll go to the next level, which would be like a future glorification. Like Edwards believed, like I talked about in the last episode, 5 layers of glorification. And it's almost like there's rewards for your different glorificational class. It's like classes still exist: the rich, the poor, the mids. And is this what this passage then is alluding? That your actions on earth will give you better placement in your glorified state?
That's what it seems to be alluding, unless we can translate this as maybe if he would have just said in the kingdom, you'd be welcomed into the kingdom. That makes sense, because there's a lot of interesting kingdom talk in the New Testament where Jesus says, don't hinder the children from coming to me because the kingdom belongs to them. Now, a preterist would understand this to mean that the kingdom was literally going to be given to these children in 70 AD. So but unfortunately their parents weren't going to be able to see this promised land / kingdom. Just like in the Old Testament, the fathers were not allowed to enter the promised land. The children were. So this is a slap in the face to the fathers of these children. Jesus is saying, these children are going to enter into the kingdom, which is coming in 70 AD when the temple's destroyed. And that's a whole nother thing. But even let's just say that that's not the case. At least if he would have said into the eternal kingdom or into kingdom homes or something about the kingdom, then we'd have a little bit more clues here. The only 2 things we have to work with is eternal and tabernacle or skenos.
Do you think you can make kingdom, or an interpretation in your view, do you think kingdom and eternity are in somewhat a synonymous state?
So, I thought you'd never ask.
That's what I do.
If you come with me to paradise again, I took the liberty of looking up the lemma, the Greek lemma for ion. Over here, you can see that. So now when we look at all the times that this Greek term is used throughout the New Testament, we have this whole list here. And we don't need to go throughout this whole thing. You can see the different ways it's used. I've already went through it. There is no mentions of kingdom that I saw. And again, if you guys know of a verse where age and kingdom seem to be synonymous, then, and the term for kingdom is basileus.
Well, what I would say is, just like our English language, words may have different usage in the context of how you're saying something, like an actual definition. But when you're talking about a meta narrative, like what is the meaning here? What is the context? There are words that are used synonymously, even though they have different specific definitions. The context can be justified as saying, well, this is what they mean, because you know what the context is. So the context supersedes the definition. I would assume that at some point, everything you read, that's why context is king. Could you imply the fact that when Jesus is talking about the kingdom, he's inferring an eternal state, a spiritual state, the end state? Of course, it exists now, but how does it exist now and in the future? Because it's metaphysical, it's spiritual. So I would assume you could allude the fact that anytime he alludes something eternal, he's not excluding kingdom. You would have to assume that the kingdom is the eternal condition also. So there's a meta context, which is his overarching narrative, even though the definitions may, of course, specifically be different.
Right, and I get that, and I agree 100%. But when you look at these, the term for kingdom again is it's not Basileus, it's Basileia. Basileus is actually king. The term for age, as we know, is different than kingdom. And he didn't use the word kingdom here. And unfortunately, there's no parallel passages in the other three gospels to give us more information. Like maybe he used kingdom in this passage, in this gospel, but age in this one.
Well, one comes to mind. The famous passage everybody knows. He used Ion there too, which is, and I will be with you until the end of the age.
Mm-hmm.
But that's an inference to the eternal kingdom, because the kingdom is within. The kingdom is now, at least if you believe Jesus is king now. The kingdom is now, but he infers that I will be with you until the end of the age. So the inference is that even in that sense of the word Ion, there is an inference to this eternal kingdom condition, but that's the meta context. That's the narrative. Yeah, of course, the word is age there.
So what's interesting, and I'm going to try not to go onto that other rabbit trail, but when Jesus, I agree with all that. That's what I'm saying. Like, so I'm going to try not to go on this rabbit trail too long, but even when Paul talks about, Christ being king now in 1 Corinthians 15, I think it's 26 to 28, you guys can look it up on your own time. But Paul talks about Christ being king and ruling right now until he puts every enemy under his foot, last one being death, and then he will give the kingdom to his Father. What's interesting is that was a commonly held Jewish belief at that time, that there was actually 10 kings who would rule the world. And they start with there's weird people that we would never expect in our westernized thoughts. I think it was Enoch, and then Noah, and then I can't remember. There was all throughout the Old Testament, and then the ninth one was believed to have been the Messiah. The ninth king was supposed to be the Messiah, so that's the one they were waiting for, was the ninth king of the world. And then Yahweh would be the final king, the number 10, king number 10. So, oh no, I was wrong. God, Yahweh, was the first king, and he's the last king. And this is what, is echoed throughout, like Isaiah, even in Revelation. Jesus/Yahweh claims to be the first and the last. And in the Greek and the Hebrew, it actually says generations. So he's the first generation and the last generation. What that's referring to is the generation of kings. So Yahweh was believed, if you look at the Talmudic literature, Yahweh was believed to be the first king and the last king. The Messiah was supposed to be king number 9. So all Paul is saying here is he's echoing the commonly held Jewish thought. That's why he didn't explain it so much. He was saying Jesus is going to subject everything because he's the Messiah, and he's still God. He's not Michael the archangel. Michael was never considered a king and never will be. Jesus would subject everything under his feet, and then he would pass the kingdom to the final king, Yahweh. So Yahweh, the first and the last. He's the first and the last. He's the summation of all the kings of history. Because, Yahweh is always the king. So with that thought, when Jesus says, I'm going to be with you to the end of the age, he's talking about the end of his rule before he gives the kingdom back to his Father.
Yeah, the cliche theological debate with something like that is when you hear people argue about his mediatorial kingdom comparative to his messianic kingdom. And usually that verse comes into the context, which is, what kingdom is he giving? Is there an eternal kingdom that Christ has, or does it come to an end? And is there something else alluded to? And so it's not a foreign concept that there's something here. And what does that allude to? And that would be back to the context. What does the end of this age really mean?
Well, that's more allusions to Jesus as God too, because the Jews always saw Yahweh as always being king, even though he let earthly kings rule throughout these 9 different stages. I guess technically it could be 8. If Yahweh's the first and last, it'd be 8 different stages that he allowed kings to rule. And I guess he himself would be number 9 and 10.
And you can see why people like Darby and Schofield could see those kind of allusions and then make things dispensational by those kind of allusions when they predicate so much of an Old Testament, a hard line of this Old Testament, New Testament dichotomy.
The difference, though...
there is a difference. I'm not saying it, but I can see how somebody can allude those facts by making those...
You can't... Yeah, and just for everyone else out there, this can't be confused with dispensationalism. There is no parallels. These are not different dispensations. They're just different kings on the earth. And they don't match up with what Darby and Schofield and MacArthur would say dispensations
I'm not saying
were.
that. I'm saying because you can see separations if you want to pretend what they are. Of course, with them, there's the same king, so they're going to have the same communication, the same focus, the same objective. With dispensations, it's clearly going to be isolative communication. Like they're just, their idea, they're dispersing. God is actually dispersing a whole new form of communication. Of course, these kings wouldn't have different communicational standpoints. They're just like any other nation. They're just going to be different rulers, but they wouldn't change their format per se. It's just going to be a different ruler. But like I was saying, I could see if somebody was looking into that, they could find some way to construct an idea like dispensationalism if they really wanted to.
Yeah, but again, so I have the list here, what the Jews thought the kings were. The 10 kings of the earth were God is number 1, and then it went to Nimrod, and then to Joseph, and then to Solomon, then to Ahab, then to Nebuchadnezzar, and then to Cyrus, to Alexander, and then to the Messiah, and then it would be given back to Yahweh in the end. Now, the Jews did not believe that the Messiah would be God. That would be the difference between the Jewish and Christian understandings of the Messiah. So these cannot be confused with the modern dispensationalism. And unfortunately for Darby and Schofield and Schaeffer and Walvoord and all of these great minds, they spent their time studying modern Israel, and they forgot to study ancient Israel, in which the Bible is concerned with, Old and New Testament. So they had a fascination, unfortunately, with the Israel of their day, which is today.
It kind of connects in this illusionary thought, too, because all these people, like we were saying in the beginning, where your millennial disposition would be. Because if you're a dispensationalist, you're going to be premillennial. And so it would make sense why. Because the dichotomy is so strong that, it's not for us anyway. We're going to be captured out of here. And the Jews are going to get the earth, not us. We are the side chick. We're the bride of Christ. But Christ is actually going to give these people their land promises. And that's what I allude to. Like if somebody looks into this and tries to partition it to say, well, if there's allusions to these like partitional splits of ruling, and in the end it's a continuation of Jewish rule, these kings, well then maybe in the end they're going to get this final kingdom on earth.
Yeah, and they also have to do something with this passage in Luke 16, 1-9. This parable is just it's such a strange thing for Jesus to say. And it's a hard rock for dispensationalists to fall on. as much as amillennialists, because this definitely seems to point to a post-millennial understanding that this earth is where you're going to spend eternity. And therefore, you need to make friends on this earth and with their homes. In fact, make friends, if you will, make friends with wealthy people with big homes. If you want to live in a big home forever in eternity, in the eternal homes, you want to make friends with wealthy people because that's where it's at. If we can understand Jesus correctly here, now you don't have to. I mean, you can make friends with poor people too. I mean, but make sure it has enough room for you to stay in their home, I guess.
So bring us home then. Tell us how you deal with this passage as an all-millennialist and how you can continue that narrative, or is there just not enough clarity here or justification to continue that position? And is this passage really just a concrete nail to say, well, maybe I need to give it up and become post-millennial? How do you rectify this as an all-millennialist?
Well, I'm also a preterist, which is very rare for amillennialists, and I don't know why. I wish there was more preterist amillennialists. Unfortunately, if they're out there, they just don't write books. So typically preterists are post-millennialists. But how I see this, and this is where I'm at a conflict, because as a preterist, I try to let the text speak for itself. If Jesus is talking to these people, he's talking to those people. So I have to say that the eternal homes are here and now. And it's very difficult for me, again, as an amillennialist, I have to spiritualize this passage and say he's talking about some kind of spiritual home. So almost like, so I guess how I interpret this, very simply put, if I'm a believer, I'm a member of the spiritual kingdom, and I'm going to church with other believers in the spiritual kingdom, we're all going to be in the same tabernacle in the end, the spiritual world. So don't make enemies with them. Like what Woody says at the end of Toy Story, he says, so play nice, because those toys see everything.
So are you alluding that the friends he's are talking about are not the friends of the general world, but the friends are exclusive to the church?
Yeah, and we can pull that a little bit from the passage. He calls this manager a dishonest manager. So it seems like he's alluding that this is how the earthly people function. You guys need to function like that, but for the eternal side of things. So it seems like we could probably put this split there. Now, post-millennials would say, no, there's no split, but as an amillennialist, I could probably say there's a split here.
So what you're saying is he's using this clever steward as a paradigm of what is normal in the world, and he's trying to use it as an illustration to the believers as, don't be very different than that, least you end up having nothing. But I assume you wouldn't say that Jesus is alluding to be shady like that to the friends, if the friends are the church, because this guy was shady.
Yeah, no. He's saying if the dishonest manager can do it, then why can't you guys do it? It's very much the same way when he says, you being evil, when your children ask you for, bread or a fish, you don't give them a rock or a snake. How much more will your heavenly Father? So again, there's this dichotomy here, it seems like. He's not telling you to be evil. He's just saying this is the reality of it. You're evil, you're dishonest, but you can at least aim that towards a spiritual reality.
Yeah, so he's saying, don't be naive and think you're going to be super righteous and super holy and be like the Pharisees that want to follow all these laws and rules and think you're so different than everybody else. He's trying to say everybody does this because this is like almost a function of how the world works that he created. And so he knows people that are dishonest are going to take that to advantage and manipulate it. So he's basically saying, do as the Pharisees say, just don't do what they do. So he's giving you an analogy here. This is what people do. So yes, you need to be wise, just like they're trying to be wise. Just don't follow their actual actions, which is shady and cheating and doing all that. But you still need to be wise like they were.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I see that.
Yeah, just be nice to the people here and now, because when you're in your eternal homes, and I would say this is probably what makes me lean more again, teeter-tottering here on the amillennial perspective of this passage is that if I'm a post-millennialist, I would have to see this as physical, and then I would have to say that this already happened. So the eternal homes are already here, and Jesus was talking to those people then, and they already died, so they didn't get to live in the eternal homes.
Well, I guess somebody could allude the fact, and like I always am, going to be the
advocate.
Yeah. They could allude that that's what's being built. Like Jesus says, he's going to build a home for you. So it's predicated on the resurrected state. So in your glorified condition, you'll get those homes. Of course, you can't get them now because you're not going to live forever.
Right, but those people back then can't make friends with people today.
No,
so they're not going to be able to live in, Bill Gates' home because they're not friends with Bill Gates, and they can't be because there's 2,000 years between them.
Yeah, but whatever they were doing, it's almost as though if you did very well, like if you believe in this progressive glorification, if you did very well, God's going to gift you an eternal home. But if you didn't, you're just going to be a trash cleaner. You'll be in there, but you're not going to be gifted anything. But if you did very well, God's going to say, well, welcome into this gifted home. I'm going to give it to you. It may not be something you yourself built, but because you stored up these treasures, I am now going to gift you this in your progressive glorification.
Yeah, I guess, but then what's the point of making friends in the here and now?
So that you can get the gift. That's your reward that you're storing in heaven so that you can reap that reward in your future eternal home.
And see, and that's tough because in the passage itself, this dishonest manager is making friends with people he knows. He's telling them, cut the bills in half. That way he can make friends with them. That's the whole point of him telling them, cut the bills in half, so he can be friends with them. So that way they'll feel like they owe him something. I'll let you live with me in the eternal homes, in the eternal estate. This seems like a very, very direct one-to-one relationship between the man and his friends. What's the point it just seems like there's a disconnect there.
Yeah, that's why I was alluding in the beginning. I'm not saying that's my actual position on it, and I'm not going to go into that. But that's why it alludes to the fact that if Jesus was always warning these people in the Olivet Discourses about a very tough time where even the elect may be deceived, you're going to need some shelter, some protection, something, or you're not going to be here no more at all. And this whole entire gospel idea is going to be gone. So it almost, like if you connect it to a meta-narrative, and again, I'm not saying this is my actual opinion on it, but it could make sense in the sense because he is talking to those direct people. And if it is in that time frame, it's going to be something very soon to those people. And this is going to be the only reason why you would need to worry about some home or protection or condition of your future estate, at least living, eating, sleeping, is that you need to be wise amongst yourself so that you can continually have something, a place to stay, a church to be, money to eat and buy. And if you're not wise with it like these people are, there's going to be a time soon that this eternal home, this gospel idea, it's not even going to exist at all. You're going to have nothing. And so
it seemed like Jesus was convinced that it was about to happen. And even in their lifetime, saying, he's talking to them. He's saying, you need to make friends, make money, but also make friends because you want a place to stay.
Yeah, it did happen in their lifetime. A lot of them died before that, but they taught it to their disciples that this is happening. So it did happen in their lifetime.
But I'm saying the eternal homes never came, or did the eternal, like forever homes? In fact, again, the Greek term is skenos, so it's not homes like oikoinos, it's skenos. It's actually tent or tabernacle. So these eternal tents, eternal tabernacles were already issued.
And see, that's going to go down another road. Again, I don't want to break it all down, but when you think about the tabernacle or dwelling in the Old Testament, that is specifically connected to God's presence, God's home. You could say that's about the church. You could say that's about the kingdom. You could say about something that alludes something greater than your personal well-being. So what you're doing is for this larger meta goal, which would be preserving the kingdom, preserving the church, preserving things for this eternal tabernacle or eternal dwelling. And if you look at it on that placement, it's not for you. It's for the larger kingdom. And that's the benefit of being wise.
Yeah, but this is plural. It's eternal. Even the eternal is in the plural. So the homes and the tabernacles and the eternality are both
But as well as we do, is that you have one kingdom, but there's multiple churches in that kingdom. There's multiple leaders, multiple functions. So all I'm saying is it's to say that it only can mean one thing. You can say that, but that's within your lens. That's what I'm saying. If a postmillennialist say it cannot be interpreted outside of this postmillennial lens, I'm saying if you think about it enough, there are many ways to see how the disciples in that day would have took that passage, and to think that they would have understood this passage in a postmillennial lens, like they would have saw this big future where they're going to be in this Edwardian glorified understanding of these 5 levels of glory and all this progressive glorification. That's really tough to believe as well. So I would have to say, if you want to be honest, postmillennialists, what was Jesus trying to teach these disciples in their time when they were living?
I think the disciples, again, just being Israelites, and again, the tabernacles, to add what you were saying, that just that term, skenos, or the tabernacle or tents, implied an exodus. And that's what they were waiting for, is another exodus. So this is what Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, was all about. So they would all go travel to Jerusalem. This is one of the 3 times a year all the Jews were required to travel from all over the Roman Empire to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. And as they traveled, they're supposed to grab palm branches and build little tents and tabernacles as they went. And it was actually a really fun event. And it sounds kind of fun. If you like camping, that's what they would do. They would leave their homes and they'd go travel to Jerusalem as a symbol of what they did in Egypt. They were taken from Egypt. And it's just a recurring theme all throughout the Old and the New Testament. And you see it in Revelation. This is the whole point. When Yahweh in Revelation is seen as covering the saints with his tabernacle, he's saying, first of all, you guys are priests. That's why you're allowed into his tabernacle, the big tabernacle. But secondly, I just saved you guys from the wrath, from the judgment that I was putting on the pagans, the Egyptians. So they're pilgrims. This word tabernacle literally just means pilgrim. It's synonymous with pilgrim, just like age is synonymous with kingdom. So they were all thinking, it's a time of pilgrimage, an eternal pilgrimage. So this earth is not our home. This is not our home. And again, this is all just towards the amillennialist understanding of this passage. If you say the word skenos.
Another thing I would allude to, like another possibility, is you could see it as, like when you're talking about the festivals and Passover and the Exodus to Jerusalem. That's what happened during the Passover and Pentecost. And you could say this is when the Holy Spirit manifested into his home, your holy tabernacle, he comes into this temple. And so all I'm trying to point out is to say that this can have some very exclusive leaning, that it's only a post-millennial interpretation. I think one has to be transparently honest to say, you have to look into the lens of what was Jesus trying to say overarchingly. Was he trying to say, you need to clean up Rome? You need to, build a lot of nice houses and become rich, just like the Romans. So then you can have a actual physical house like the Romans. Or was he talking about something a lot more larger in his narrative? And there's many ways we could probably try to interpret this, but yeah, we have to be sensitive that we have our lenses. We just can't be closed down to say that's all it is.
Well, if we're just taking its plain meaning, that's where it becomes difficult. Its plain meaning seems to be more, to me, it seems to lean more post-millennial, but that causes other problems.
I would say it contradicts a lot of Jesus's principles, because his principles, as he was teaching through many times, even like the Sermon on the Mount.
Well, I was actually going to say the same thing. Jesus actually told him, the meek will inherit the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And this seems to literally echo that same thing. If you're meek, you're kind to people, and you're going to inherit the earth. So get ready to inherit the earth right now. It seems like, and this is what caused C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis saw this too. Unfortunately, in his ignorance, he refused to pick up Josephus and other ancient literature, and that's okay for him. But in his ignorance, he says that Jesus made the most embarrassing claims. Jesus. He says it's unfortunate, and if there's anything that showed Jesus's humanity is this most embarrassing things that he said. Like he predicted things and he was just wrong. He was flat out wrong, and everybody can see it. The things he thought was going to happen didn't happen. So I don't want to err on the side of C.S. Lewis. And for anyone who wants to read that, that's in his essay called "The World's Last Night." He has other ones on prayer that he also alludes to the same idea. So it's not like he was.
Yeah, but what's difficult about this section itself, again, if you're taking the literal reading, you have to decide, is this parable telling you to follow this guy's actions? As in being, I need to be shrewdish. I need to be wise with my money. I need to make sure that all of this earthly wealth, this being a steward, the reasons I need to do that is so that I can guarantee my eternal home. That would be the literal context. And is that what Jesus is saying? You need to make sure you're wise with your money. You need to make sure that you build the friends that can guarantee you these essence of the future state of wealth and condition and money. Because if not, you will not have an eternal home.
It almost seems like Jesus puts friendship in this passage over money. Like, before you make money, you should make friends, because money, it almost alludes to the idea, seems to imply actually that there's not going to be currency in the eternal state, in the resurrected state. It's not going to be any kind of currency. So you're chasing after this mammon right now. You're trying to serve money, but you're going about it all wrong. You need to go try to make friends, because that's who's going to let you into the house. Money's not going to let you into its house, but friends will.
But it's not any friend. It has to be friends that have homes. So somebody has wealth. So it's almost like you have maybe nothing, but you better make friends who have something so you can have something.
Yeah.
And so it's still predicated on your eternal condition, is predicated on your shrewdness. Like, I see you have money over there. I'm going to be friends with you because I need a place in the end. And
it is difficult because Jesus tells that rich young ruler to sell everything.
That's what I'm saying. There's many principles that are echoed throughout that says, if this is what Jesus is saying here, how do you mash this in with the rest of his echoing, which seems very different than being focused on eternal wealth and eternal earthly wealth and eternal earthly generation of our condition on this place. Like, we need to be wealthy, we need to be rich, we need to be politically savvy, we need to do all these things. When Jesus would say stuff like, give unto Caesar's what is Caesar's and give unto God's what is God's, he's making this dichotomy that you should see there's a separation. And how do you mash that kind of literalness in it? Maybe you can, but I guess my proposition is, don't be so ignorant to say, that's the only way you can take this passage, because every passage has to make a meta narrative. Like, Jesus said something as a message. He didn't just say, here's one statement, here's another statement, and they all just mean something separately. You can't take Jesus's word as isolated statements. He came to preach a gospel. He came to preach a message, and that message all is contextually. Like, if you believe the Bible, I guess that's the big debate. Do you believe the Bible is univocal? It all has one message through many authors. Or do you believe they're separate? They can be broke apart separately. That gets a little Gnostic. That means you found some secret nugget that nobody else could see.
Yeah, well, on that little rabbit trail, I would just say I believe both. It's univocal and multivocal. It's there's a plurality of vocals.
Yeah. Well, either way, what you'll have to do is then it's left down to the individual on that, because that's just subjective. How do you choose which one is univocal and not? Every person can do that, but that's where it comes down to the point. If you even say that, what you're saying is everything can't be pinned down to it only can be seen in this lens.
Yeah, well, if you err too far on either side, then yeah, seeing it as only univocal, and you can't let Paul be Paul or Peter be Peter or whoever. You end up becoming this person who interprets it in a modern light. Like, all these words have eternal value, which I agree 100%. But if you just say that's it didn't have any value for the people that originally heard it. Like, why Jesus said, for example, the mustard seed is the smallest seed on the earth.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. What scholars mean by univocal is that God breathed all of it,
Right, I get
and that God's narrative is the whole thing is one voice of God.
Mhm.
Of course, they all had their individual historical propagations of the way they distributed the reality, but nobody's contradicting nobody because the universal narrative is the same narrative. That's the univocal voice. But a lot of critical scholars said there is no such thing as univocality. Every person saw God and it was a different God. Even though they all called it that, they just experienced God. And it's us, modern people, that try to force it all into one univocal narrative.
Right, yeah. Like I said, you don't want to err on either side too far.
Yeah. But that's my thing is when I see passages like, and there's a lot of them like that, you either have to believe that Jesus is trying to show us something that's connected with his main objective, or you have to believe that Jesus is just trying to teach you something isolative.
Yeah, because again, Jesus could have told them about quantum physics, but being God, he knew all about that and so much more. But he said stuff that they could understand. The mustard seed, you all know, the mustard seed is the smallest seed on the earth. So that just that itself, and well, I'm not going to get into the Greek term for earth there, but he is talking in terms of they understand. He could have just sat there and started saying, now, in 2025, there's going to be cars and dune buggies and started explaining all this stuff, but they wouldn't understand it. It would have no value for them at that moment. Yeah. So he was talking on terms that they could understand.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. That's why it's interesting to me if Jesus was preaching stuff like the Olivet Discourses, if he's predicating stuff that you need to prepare for something that's going to be soon, it would make sense that it's going to be something that's going to be very relative to them. The context needs to be relative to them. It just can't be some, like postmillennialism is very far in the future, but they wouldn't know that. There's no way they could know that. But so if this was to be something very real to them, then it would have to be something that they need to know now. Unless, of course, Jesus wasn't really talking to the disciples. He was talking to the future church. And that's what I mean. It is like they always say, what univocal really is the gospel is the Old Testament and the New Testament really all about the gospel? Is that the univocal message? Or are they all just a bunch of separate messages? And I assume most Orthodox, in the sense that, we are Protestant Christians, believe that it's all about the gospel. And that is the message. And we need to see that as a theme. And Jesus says in Mark 1:15, that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to preach the gospel. And so if we see Jesus' theme is always trying to preach this gospel, this has to be seen in the light. But then we have to say, what is he trying to prepare his disciples in the context of the gospel narrative for them?
Well, I was going to say that's the other thing, too. You have to let the Bible, if it's going to be univocal, and I agree, you have to let it define the gospel. We can't say the gospel is John 3:16 or whatever. Jesus explicitly says the gospel, he preaches the gospel that the kingdom of heaven is here or at hand. However you want to translate that Greek, it means the same thing. And yeah, the Old Testament does the same thing. So we can actually let the Old Testament preach the gospel. You see it in the Garden of Eden when they're kicked out, and God actually says, your seed singular in the Hebrew, is going to crush the head of the serpent. So the gospel can be found no matter where, in Genesis all the way to Revelation, the same. So we don't have to impose our modern ideas as long as we're not tampering with the definition that the gospel, that the Bible gives us for the gospel itself. And if we listen, I love Charles Spurgeon, but when he says stuff like the tulip is the gospel, I would say maybe, but let's find out. Let's go back to the scripture and figure out what they preach.
I think when people say things like that, of course, they're being hyperbolic, I assume. It's better to say things like, you can see a description of the gospel in such narratives, but you can find a description of the gospel in a lot of narratives. Depends on your interpretation of those narratives. But yeah, I would warn against something like that. That's so eisegetical. It's like, I see that. That doesn't mean this is the universal meaning of that. But yeah, well, there's a lot of things here. But to summarize up, as you posed last time, have you converted?
Not yet. I'm still teetering. I am leaning more towards the amillennial view of this because, even if Jesus is talking to his immediate disciples at that time, and I would say he is, and I think everybody would say he is, then these eternal homes that would be given to them would have to be relevant for their time as well. And so I don't think this is talking about the final resurrection. I think it's talking about the spiritual kingdom that they were able to enjoy as soon as they died. So as those disciples died, they were entering into their eternal homes. And I think Jesus was saying, be friends with each other now. And maybe he was even telling this to the disciples because maybe they were bickering. They did that a lot. So he was telling them, you guys need to love each other because you're going to be with each other, living in these eternal homes with each other forever, eternally.
So to summarize, basically what they usually tell people, if you can't enjoy church now, why would you want to be in church for eternity? So if you can't enjoy your friends here, why would you want to be in eternal homes with them forever?
Yep.
I see. Well, you guys tell us what you think in the comments. There's a lot to break down with this little passage, the clever little Steward. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this conversation. Check us out next week. Colleague didn't tell us any mysteries packages for next week, but
well, depending on the comments, maybe we'll respond to the comments if there's good comments regarding this video and what we talked about, and if you guys can sway me to a post-millennial light, or maybe reassure my amillennial light, or even a premillennial light, then I'm all ears and we can talk about it. But if nobody comments, then yeah, I guess we'll just move on.
Yeah. Well, either way, stay tuned in for next week. You never know what the conversation is going to be, but it's going to be a good one. But we appreciate all you guys listening. Check us out on the podcast, on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, Table Talk TV, or check us out every Sunday. But until next week, that is Colleague. And I am host. But this is Table Talk TV. We'll see you next week.